Welcome to another episode of Jamming with Jason. Hey, today I have a very special guest with me, Sara James. And I'm not really sure where this podcast is going to go exactly, but we're going to talk about music, probably is going to come up, communications, how we're working as teams. And so stay tuned because you are going to want to listen to this episode because it's going to entertain you as well as educate you. So, with that, let's roll the episode.
Hi, I'm Jason Mefford, and you're in the right place to start transforming your career and life with this podcast. I've been in the trenches as an executive leader, and now I'm an executive coach and confidential advisor to executives all over the world. I use a multidisciplinary approach to improve learning that drives transformation by getting to the root cause in a practical, no-nonsense way. I love learning and sharing what makes people tick. You get both education and entertainment, since learning shouldn't be boring, right? But that's enough about me. This podcast is a combination of intuitive leadership, neural influence, and mental mastery to take your career and life to levels you've never thought possible. If you're wanting to improve yourself, develop stronger relationships professionally and personally, make quicker, better decisions, and become a more effective leader, then of course, this podcast is for you because you are going to learn how to manage emotions in yourself and others, avoid burnout, stress, and anxiety, master your mind, get people to listen and take action, and become a lifelong learner. And when you do that, you will have a positive mental attitude, executive leadership presence, and the skills to know exactly what to say and do in any situation. I'm glad you're here. So, let's get started.
All right, Sara, welcome. I'm excited to be talking with you today. I know we've talked a few times before, and we both like to go down little rabbit holes. So I'm excited for today's episode because I'm not sure what exactly we're going to talk about, but it's going to be beneficial for people, right? So welcome, Sara. How you doing?
All the better for being here with you, Jason. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is such an honor, especially given some of the great and good that have already appeared on your podcast and from whom I've learned a lot, really. I think it's a fantastic thing you're doing here.
Thank you. That's a good way to start stroking my ego to get us going, right?
No bad thing.
No. Well, before we get started, just for people that aren't familiar with you already, just give kind of a brief background as to who you are, what you do, and then, like I said, let's jump in because we talked before. There's a lot of different places we can go here, and we want to make this pretty conversational, entertaining, as well as educational for people. So yeah, tell people a little bit about yourself, and then let's start going down some rabbit holes.
Excellent. Rabbit holes await. In the meantime, I'm Sara James, and I run a business called Getting Words to Work. See what I did there? And
Oh,
my obsession is internal audit report writing because I know how to have fun. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to run tailored internal audit report writing training, but also training for risk and compliance specialists and even people outside assurance functions across the globe. So a lot less travel over the past year, but I'm still delivering the training. And last count, I delivered it to over 5,000 people globally.
yeah.
Everyone's still alive, no visible bruises. And more to the point, they say that, when they follow the tips and the techniques I share and the really practical exercises, that it makes their lives a little bit easier. And, who doesn't need that, especially these days? So you asked a little bit about my background, which you will not be surprised is kind of international. Real emphasis on languages. I speak several. it's open for debate how much sense I make in any of them. I suppose it depends what time of the day you catch me. But yeah, about my background, maybe not the traditional path into audit. So I started as an academic, specializing in languages and literature. So already there was that passion for the word. And I researched and taught at universities in France and the U.S. and the U.K., and also worked in academic and research and reference publishing in France, the U.S. and the U.K. And then what I like to say is I got tired of being poor. So I ran away to what people call the real world, which still makes me laugh. And I worked in IT and then in finance, which are two of the sectors
Because IT and finance is the real world.
yeah, it's the real world. And as we know, they use language so carefully and judiciously and elegantly, not. But when I was in both of those sectors in different companies, I started getting a taste of internal audit. And so I've been a member of the Institute of Internal Auditors for quite some time now, of course. I'm a certified internal auditor. And for an extra frisson of amusement, I'm on the Technical Guidance Working Group in the U.K.IA. So we do a lot of good stuff, I think, or we try to for the members, and put out lots of guidance about internal audit engagements, but also about fun things like data protection and tax law and really exciting stuff like that. But, trying to help make our members' lives easier. So, yeah, that's what I do in between all of the teaching and the training and the coaching and the consultancy.
Well, I know it's interesting because you said, you transitioned into IT, finance. They obviously have their own language. Internal audit as well has their very own specific language, right? And I think, we'll jump into that more because I think a lot of the language we try to use is a put off to most other people, right? Because we use certain words to mean certain things, but the rest of the world uses those words to mean something completely different, right? And so when you don't get people to listen to you, or people are kind of scrunching up their nose when you say something, you're like, what? I'm just talking, right? That's part of the reason for it, right? But I love what you do too. I mean, I don't do much training anymore, but if I do, it's only going to be customized training. Which, again, there's dime a dozen stuff that's out there. There's not very many people that actually really customize it and make it to what you're doing. So I'm glad that there's somebody else like you out there that's helping people actually customize this to where people need to go.
I think that's interesting what you're saying, because the customizing, I've just realized as you were speaking, it gives me a particular insight, and it helps me see how internal audit and other assurance functions are developing over the years. Because typically I'll receive about a dozen writing samples from a client, so I can tailor the training to their needs. And what I see is certain things developing. I also see when people respond maybe to periods of crisis, either by trying something that's completely out there, or by going back to what is tried and tested, but maybe not best for, that situation. I mean, I've got lots of experience with teams across the globe in all sorts of sectors. And so, of course, there are huge cultural differences, not just nationally, regionally, but within, sectors and organizations. And I'll adapt to those differences, but I'm also seeing the commonalities, what brings internal auditors together across the globe. And one thing I'm thinking is what you were just referring to, is the sheer tone deafness that we can sometimes exhibit when I'd like to think I don't do it so much because I'm attuned to it after nearly 33 years of working with language and languages. But we do fall back on certain terms that sound at best dry and at worst slightly grudging. And I'm thinking, for instance, the term adequate. When we assess a control as being adequate, if somebody's
Well,
put
I
their
don't know
heart
about. I don't know about you, but I love to be considered adequate, right? Isn't that just like one of the biggest compliments you can give somebody? Oh, Sarah, you're adequate.
Jason, I think we said that, this isn't the therapy moment to talk about our childhoods.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it does tie into people's insecurities. And you think, when you've come across somebody who's put their heart and soul, quite sadly, into developing actually what is a very rigorous, well-designed, well-thought-out control, and you say, yes, that's adequate. What a letdown. What's stopping us saying, okay, that's really thorough. I see how you've brought in all the relevant, regulation, and you're looking at best practice. You've benchmarked it. So if you can actually get people to do that, that's a really good control. What's stopping us saying it? And the answer is nothing.
Well, just preconceived notions, right? I mean, again, this is one of the reasons why I'm trying to shake people a little bit and wake them up, right?
Yeah.
Because we just go and use words like adequate, right?
Yes.
And we don't think anything of it, but to the person who's hearing it, that's pretty offensive, right?
Well,
Like you said, somebody's been working really hard. It's like,
it's
oh,
like
you're
a C
telling me
plus,
I'm
isn't it?
adequate. Yeah, right.
It's a C plus on something you thought was at least a B plus or maybe an A minus if you caught the teacher on a good day, and they're
Mhm.
telling you it's a C plus, whereas maybe it's an A minus.
Mhm. Well, and
But
so like you
yeah.
said, I mean, you call your business getting words to work, right? So
Mm.
so here's one of those things, right? Is I mean, again, we look at that word adequate. What are some better words that we could use instead of saying adequate?
I would say it depends. Show me your working papers. Show me your thought process. Tell me about the context. Tell me about your audience. Tell me what it is you want to inspire them to do to improve things in their organization, because all of those things will influence the words you choose. And I always say in the transaction between writer and reader, and one thing I didn't mention is I'm still a professional writer and copy editor.
Mhm.
Um, in between the other things I do, the only person who matters is the reader. And I think very often writers get in their own way and then they get in the reader's way. I think fear is behind a lot of things. So people in risk or assurance or audit functions are very risk averse. And I see people falling back on a very narrow, sometimes impoverished vocabulary that they feel is safe. And they say, well, if I pick from, say, this column of pre-approved words, and then I tack on something from this column of phrases that my manager has signed off in a previous report, and then I maybe add a buzzword or two that's making the rounds in the organization, nobody can object to that. But the thing is, their own thoughts, their own insights, their own personality is not coming through. It's lost. So they think they're playing it safe, but actually what they're doing is what George Orwell referred to as, gumming together prefabricated words and phrases. And it's tempting because it saves us the trouble of thinking really hard about what we have to say and what are the fewest best words to say it. But it helps us fill up the page pretty quickly with black marks, and we can convince ourselves we've done the job. We're rarely delivering good news. So there's another fear element there. We're rarely telling someone in the first line that their risk and control framework is a thing of beauty and a joy forever. At best, we might admit parts of it are adequate, and there are even some controls that prove to be effective.
Well,
Here endeth the lesson. But, usually we're finding fault. And it's how do we convey that clearly and concisely without fear or favor? And also without, creating unnecessary conflict or thoroughly discouraging the recipient.
Well, and it's interesting because you brought up Orwell, right? So,
Yes.
again, he's actually one of my favorite authors.
Yes.
Got several, but it's interesting because Orwell. What was the term that he used? Word speak, I think, right?
Ah, you
Where
speak.
yeah, where it was kind of the dumbing down of the language as
Yes.
well, right, in the future. And he wrote dystopian novels. So again, we don't want to live in a George Orwellian dystopia, but he was kind of describing, right, what could happen, and I think what actually is happening, where we dumb down language. You talked
Mhm.
about, pre-approved words, buzzwords, other things like that, right? Because we're trying to soften it so much that we're actually not really saying anything at the end of the day, right?
You're
and
so
and
right.
and whether that's good or whether that's bad, we're kind of dumbing it down both ways. And so again, like you said, instead of giving somebody praise, we use a word like "you're adequate," right? I mean, come on. If you're in a relationship with somebody and they say, "Do you love me?" and they say, "Well, you're an adequate lover," I mean, come on. That relationship's not going to last probably
But what if
very
they
long.
said you were effective as well, Jason?
Oh, if I was effective?
Yeah,
Well,
adequate
well,
and
again,
effective.
yeah,
Hey, we can all dream.
it's very analytical though, right?
It is, and it's although no, it's not. It's clinical. It's not analytical.
It's not okay.
I think if it were analytical, there'd be greater variety and freshness in the vocabulary. And let me make clear, I'm not asking people to fancify. There, I've just made up a word. Their writing. I'm not asking people to dredge their, you know, SAT vocabulary lists out of deep dark memory. People often think that the longer the words and the fancier the sentences, the more they're going to impress the reader. But again, they're thinking of themselves, not the reader. And so I always say, just imagine the reader and what you want them to do the minute they finish reading the report. And then think of the fewest best words
Mhm.
to inspire them to do that. Because you're talking about the dumbing down, and I would call it the diluting and the neutering of language. Because what I want to get to is to for people to answer the question, so what? See, here's me, the auditor, swinging in saying, what's the risk? So what? Why do I care? And it's actually really serious, because when people write on autopilot and they churn out these wordy, turgid sentences that could mean anything and nothing, what we eventually see is the reader reading something time and again and still having no idea what they're supposed to do. So that's a huge waste of resource. So that's a loss to the organization in purely financial terms. It's wasted time, it's wasted money. And then if they don't actually know what they're supposed to do, what are they going to do? Either the wrong thing or nothing. So, as an auditor, you failed because your reader, who is supposed to correct the problems you found, is either going to do nothing, so the risk remains unmitigated, or they might hair off in the wrong direction, down the wrong rabbit hole, and burn up time and budget and resource correcting the wrong thing, and the risk still remains unmitigated. So, we really do have these problems, and I've got two concrete examples that just popped into my head that I can share that might really bring this to life for some listeners and make them think, oh, wow, I saw this recently in working papers or a draft report. Maybe we shouldn't do that. When I worked in finance, something I saw just countless times was the weasel phrase, issues around resource. And leaving aside, that weird preposition, what are issues? Do you mean problem, but you don't have the spine to say it? Do you mean a finding? Do you mean a topic of conversation? Do you mean children? He died without issue in 1756. If something has four meanings, it has no meaning, or less meaning than you might think. And issues around resource. Okay, you've got a problem with resource. What is it? Either you don't have enough people, You have them, but you haven't trained them yet. Or you have them, you've trained them, and guess what? They are still naughty puppies, and you still have to put the newspaper down every morning. In which case, why? So unless we actually say specifically what the problem is, how can we possibly work with the first line on a solution through a recommendation? Another example I thought of was somebody very senior in audit. It wasn't a chief audit executive, but someone maybe a level below, who I think after numerous bruising encounters with first line managers who were really resistant to findings, he was he was like a poor kicked puppy. And his way of dealing with it was to water down every report to the point of nothingness. And I remember looking at one report, and I'm thinking of one person in particular, but it's not the only time I've seen it. I've read about 2,500 reports at this point. I'm still standing. And he talked about a risk of financial loss due to manual error. And I thought, okay. And then I kept reading, and I saw that all the suggested actions to correct this were really to do with tightening up anti-fraud measures. And so I said, well, I'd read it as people are making mistakes with manual entry. You know, there's a problem with the system, problem with training. What is it? The answer was, oh no, actually the problem is fraud. And I said, well, how does manual error come into it? Has somebody mistakenly keyed in their own bank account details instead of the customers?
It wasn't an error if it's fraud.
Did somebody, you know, manually make an error by dropping their moral compass in the street on the way into work? How? You know, how did you get from fraud to manual error? And the response was, well, they react so badly when we talk about risk of financial loss due to fraud. And I said, but these are two vastly different things. You know, you're actually obscuring the truth.
Well, and so here's the interesting thing when you say that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is auditors, oh, we're objective, we all these words that we like to use, but the fact, just what you just said, right, shows that that person was dumbing it down so much that they were actually almost being a little fraudulent themselves by not accurately describing what was going on, right? And so we can end up, not communicating, and actually not having that professional skepticism and due diligence that we are supposed to have in there. Because again, however you communicate, whether it's verbally or in a report, it is supposed to reflect the work that was actually done. So if you're watering it down so much that it's actually not explaining what actually happened, like risk of financial loss due to manual entry, no. Right, fraud related to AML or whatever it happened to be, right? The message isn't coming across. And in fact, I would argue that by doing that, you're outside of the standards that you're trying so badly to follow. By dumbing it down, you're actually not following the standards.
Yeah, the code of ethics, plays a role here, or should play a role. I mean, in this case, I was coaching the person, and the reason they were behaving in this way was because, as I said, they were like an oft-kicked puppy, poor thing. And, it was from anxiety and defensiveness. So it wasn't going to help for me to say, you're basically making yourself an accomplice if fraud does happen, because I don't think that would have helped. But, I said, okay, why do you think this is more effective? Because surely, if I were a senior manager, I would want to know where the holes are in my processes, in my area, that I need to plug to stop fraud happening. I said, you're not telling them they're committing fraud. You're not accusing them of anything. You're just showing where the vulnerabilities are so that they can respond. And the response was, oh, we found if we soften it, they receive it better. I said, I'm sure they do. And my question is, do they then address it in the way you expect, or do you get repeat findings? And I think you know what the answer was. Of course, repeat findings. Um, so those are two concrete examples that I've seen. I mean, I might associate them in my mind with, some specific people I've worked with, but I've certainly seen them in numerous organizations, in numerous sectors. And I think this comes back to, a point I made when we were having a conversation one day, which is the human element, the human dynamics. And you were saying we auditors, we see ourselves as objective. We try to be, but, you know, we respond to things intuitively and emotionally as well. And I think we need to be aware of that and not think that we're somehow above common human responses and blind spots and assumptions. We just have to be alert to them.
Well, and it's interesting because, I use the word analytical a lot, that I think a lot of times we are way more analytical than we should be. We need to be more emotional, not to be emotional, but we need
Mm-hmm.
to acknowledge and bring in emotion, right? But the word that you used of clinical is even stronger than the analytical, which I think is a better way of saying it, right? So let's just kind of pause for a minute and let's just make some silly ass analogy here, right? That again, if we are dumbing down our words,
Mm-hmm.
if we're using particular words like adequate, or I mean, again, there's a whole bunch of words that we're using, right? Findings, issues, all kinds of stuff, right? But if
Risk.
risk in general too, right? And we need to get away from using that word, and probably start talking about certainty management, but that's a whole idea for another
Ooh,
episode. I know. Well, you'll hear me talk about that more in the future.
that's another
But
rabbit hole.
yeah, that's another rabbit hole. We don't have time to go down today, but I will, right? Listen to future episodes. I'm going to be going down that hole. But so imagine again, right, that if
Mm-hmm.
we are being so clinical in how we're doing it, that our work papers probably look like medical records. Okay. And so again, I audited some hospitals and other medical facilities over the years. And I will tell you, it is Greek to me, right? You're reading those files and you have no clue what they're actually talking about. They're using some
Should be
very
Latin, surely.
yeah, well, I used to say Greek, but yeah, it really is Latin, right? With all of that stuff. But so again, our work papers are probably very clinical, analogized to a medical record. Now, if we're using those same terms,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're the doctor, you've got the medical record, you've got your work papers, quote unquote, right? Your medical records. Now, if you go into your patient, you've done all of these different tests, you've done all this stuff, you've got all these fancy Latin words that you use in medical terms, right? And you sit down with the person that is your patient, and you're trying to communicate to them what is going on, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm communicating to them. Well, if I sit down and say, well, Sarah, in my professional opinion as a surgeon for the last 45 years, and I happen to be, a board certified doctor of the American Physicians Association, blah 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 bullshit, right? And we ran a battery of tests on you and found out that you have a left contusion hemoglobin, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. I don't even know the terms, right? But if I say that to you, you're going to scrunch up your nose and go, what the hell are you telling me? Do I have cancer or not? Right? It's like,
I'll just tell you to go away and I'll just tell you to hand over the papers so I can read them for myself.
yeah. And the patient's not going to know, right? So how many of our audit reports are just like that, where somebody reads them and they're like, I don't even know what you're saying.
I love that you raised this point because an analogy I use all the time with my clients um, is a medical one, because time and again, I look at executive summaries that are nothing more than a condensed recital of the findings. And what I say to them is the findings are coming from your test results. The executive summary is the diagnosis. And you need to use your insight and your judgment. And at that point, people start freaking out because they say that's subjective, that's personal, that's my opinion. I say, yes, what else do you think you're being paid for besides your opinion? You know, not based on today's horoscope, but based on your experience, based on your extensive and thorough engagement work, based on the test results. I said, because otherwise you are like a patient, or you know, the first line is like the patient who goes to the doctor and says, I'm not feeling well, or it's a routine checkup. And as you say, Jason, the doctor orders a battery of tests and then calls the patient back and says, right, we've got your results, and then recites a litany of numbers.
Your
And their
vitamin D
executive
level
summary.
is 2.3. Your blah, 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 blah. And it's
Yeah.
like,
And the
but tell me
executive
what it
summary is like
means.
the litany of numbers, and the exec summary should be saying you're healthy, you're not well. If you're not well, this is how bad it is, and this is what you need to do. And that seems to ring a bell with them. But to get from their comfort zone of being able to quantify things, and again, putting that very objective clinical gloss on things, to insight and judgment, and putting some of your own personal slant on it. You know, not talking about prejudice or assumption or bias, but talking about, you know, you, Jason, with all of your experience in all the different fields you worked in, you're bringing a body of work and knowledge to bear that can't be quantified, but it's an essential part of bringing that executive summary, that diagnosis to life. But it's really hard, I think, to get people in assurance functions to do that. Especially, I find, if they've got accountancy backgrounds, they cling to the quantifiable as if it's their blankie. And I do have to say often to junior auditors that just because you can count something doesn't mean it counts. You know. And especially with risk-based internal audit, you know, very often the biggest and scariest risks might not be easily quantifiable.
Typically, they're not. That's
Exactly.
what scares people, and that's why they tend to go away from it and go audit something silly like $100,000 thing over here when they're ignoring a $50 million issue over on the other side. Yeah,
Absolutely. And you know, one thing I can think of is a finding that I use from a public audit body, not in the US, but they publish by law all of their reports, and they publish a report on the criminal justice system in that jurisdiction. And they talked about the fact that all of the different organizations involved in criminal justice in this country, and there are hundreds of them, don't have any adequate or effective means of communicating with each other. One example they gave was they discovered that during a pilot they ran, a third of the people who court officers went to fetch from their homes to appear in court were already in prison. So they thought they were at home, they were in prison, and they had been for some time. But the court officers didn't have that information. So it's not too much of a stretch to say, well, if they think people are in prison and they're out, or they think people are home and they're in prison.
Couldn't they be in prison? They're actually sitting at home too.
And they've had cases like that where people they thought were in prison were actually released. And nobody told the responsible parties, and bad things happened. And yet the risk statements were all about efficiency and how many hundreds of thousands we could save if our communications process was more streamlined. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, you're talking about people being in prison when you think they're at home, and vice versa. And you honestly don't see any risks such as public safety, trust in the justice system, people's chance of getting a fair trial, because if all the bodies involved in criminal justice are supposed to share information, are defense lawyers getting all of the prosecution's information? There are all of these things going on. I mean, data protection out the window. None of that was mentioned. It was purely quantified. Oh, we could save 100,000 every 3 weeks if we improved this process. Well, you
See,
might stop
again,
some people getting killed as well.
well, and that's where I was going to go, right? Is again, that's a very clinical way of kind of saying it, right? Well, again, oh, we could save a couple $100,000. I'm just throwing numbers out there, right? People probably aren't going to care about that as much as, did you realize that we have 50, you know, what's the right term? Rapists who are actually like violent
Mhm.
rapists who we think are supposed to be behind bars, but are not. And
Yeah.
so, are people going to care about $100,000 of savings because of a communication breakdown, or the fact that there could be 50 violent criminals that are out there
Yeah.
and
And
stopping
maybe
the next victim from being victimized, right?
and maybe they've served their sentence and they've been released appropriately. But if you haven't told the probation officer, if you haven't told the people who are supposed to arrange, secure housing, if you haven't told the people who are supposed to provide support, what do you think is going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Things are going to fall between the cracks, and the consequences are a little bit worse for everyone involved than some, missed opportunities to make savings. And I think that's an extreme case, but certainly public sector is where all this scary stuff happens, isn't it? It's where, in the UK, where we have the National Health Service, that's where people get their health care. This public sector, it's where you have prisons, it's where you have child and family services, it's where you have probation services, it's where you have social services, the things that try to keep people alive and safe and well.
Well, and it's again, it's just a good reminder. We're gonna have to kind of wrap up because we can't. I'd love to have 2 or 3 hour episodes, but nobody would
Wow.
listen to them all the way, right?
And we
Actually, so
have gone
some
down
people like
quite a
Joe.
rabbit hole.
Well, and some people like Joe Rogan do have them, but yeah, most of the people that listen to this are like, "Hey, I'm done exercising. I got to get back to work now," or whatever it is. So,
Absolutely.
but it's just very interesting. I mean, to kind of recap a couple of the things that you said, the person who really matters is the reader. And
Yeah.
I've heard that over and over and over and over again. But the fact that again, we're doing our organizations a disservice when we dumb down, or when we make things too clinical, when we never actually call out the things that need to be called out. We're actually hurting our organization. We think, and again, I understand, like the guy you were talking about that you said was like the kicked puppy. We can sometimes, feel like, gosh, I can't say that because I'm going to get beat up again.
Yeah.
But at the same point, think about what's our job, right? And so, again, if we're not saying the things that need to be said, then who else is going to say them? That's the whole purpose for having this kind of a function in place, right? And so, again, if and you got to think about communicating to the people in a way that is going to move them as well, right? I mean, think about the last great novel that you read. Was it clinical in nature? I don't think you probably read it if it was clinical, right? It brings in some emotion, but again, there's the whole thing, like I think it was Mark Twain that said, I apologize because I'm writing you a long letter because I didn't have the time to write you a short one, right?
Exactly. It's
And
hard to do.
it's hard to do. And there's certain authors, like Steinbeck,
Yeah.
he only wrote two big books, right? What he called big books. Most of his books were like 150 pages. Why? He could say what he needed to in that time frame, elicit the emotion, tell the story, get the reader to take the action, have the feelings from it in a very short period of time, right? Hemingway was kind of the same way. His books were typically smaller books as well, because both of them, were of the opinion that, look, the book is only as long as it needs to be. You don't just keep blah, 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 blahing, right?
But it takes so much awareness and discipline
Mhm.
and hard attention to detail to distill what wants to say into something that is only as long as it needs to be and hits the mark. And I mean, just to sort of recap, or not even recap, but just, if I can leave listeners with two thoughts, it's keep it simple and keep it human. And those are really the two hardest things to do. So no long words, no long sentences. Keep things active, brief, concrete. That takes a lot of discipline. As you say, it's harder to do than just rambling page after page after page. And when I say keep it human, talk to people. We don't always want to do that. We want to send an email, send a report. But one pleasant surprise, I've been running some webinars with the head of professional practices at the U.S.A. U.K. over here during lockdowns. And it's been about what's changing in reporting during COVID that people can take with them afterwards. Because in times of crisis, things change, and sometimes it's for the better. And what we're seeing is people talking more to their audit colleagues, which they didn't do enough before, and talking to the first line and the second line. And ironically, now that they're physically not in proximity, having richer and more useful exchanges, whether it's over the phone or via Zoom or Teams or what have you, and keeping that human connection and human communication going, so that then there's a sound basis on which the report can be written and read. And some of the reports going out, I'm just punching the air and cheering, because these are 1 or 2 pagers. And there was nothing stopping them from doing it before, but it took COVID to force people to say, right, how can we distill what we've done into a 1-pager? And the recipients, the senior people in their organizations, the regulators, have been delighted, because they're getting something that's clear, concise, relevant. If they need more info, they can go and say, hey, can I just see some of the test results that back that up? And it's there, but they don't have to wade through it throughout, 20 or 30 or 70 pages. So, that's a really good thing that's come out, is the simple human side of it. Simple, but not easy.
Well, it is. And it's, that gets back to what you're saying, about the person who matters the most is the reader. And
Yeah.
again, if you've got a busy executive, I don't have time to read 50 pages. Right. And so, again, if you're going to be human about it, realize the situation that you're putting other people in. You wonder why people aren't reading your reports, because if it's 50 pages, they're not going to read it.
They can. I worked for 2.5 years with the group chief executive of a global bank, who would say, if somebody can't tell me what is happening in half a sheet of paper, then either they don't know or they're trying to hide something. And at first, I thought he was being really harsh. And then within a week or two, I saw what some of his divisional chief executives were sending me in response to what I thought were straightforward, innocent questions. And I would have to call them up and say, you come across as though you're trying to hide something. And I know you're not, but this is not going to work. Seriously,
Yeah.
Just whittle it down, half a page, no more.
Well, great stuff, Sarah. I know we got to kind of wrap up for this time. We didn't even get to talk about music this time, but maybe we'll have to do another one and jump more into. We talked more about writing, so we're talking about authors today instead. We got in some good ones too, though, right? Steinbeck, Orwell, Hemingway. We talked about any other ones too?
Some of my favorites.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
there are so many, but that is a topic for another podcast. I think you can see some of the shelves behind me. So yeah, that might need to be a bit of a marathon if we get onto either books or music. We will be here sometime. It's been
Exactly.
such a pleasure, Jason. Thank you so much.
Well, it is, and thank you for the practical side of it too, right? Because again, I think sometimes we end up just being too theoretical. There's some practical things that you threw out there today that, again, if you missed them the first time, go back and re-listen to this, right? Because
Yeah,
when you listen to it again, something is going to jump out at you as something practical that you can actually start working on this week. And just little bit at a time, chip away at it. And eventually you're going to be writing, I don't want to use the word novels, great novels like reports, because that's not the intention, but it's going to be much more relevant to the reader, much more valuable to your organization. People are actually going to get it, and they're going to take action and change instead of just ignoring your reports like they might be doing right now.
absolutely. And just an invitation to your listeners. They want to know more or get some top tips or ask any questions or even swap some reading lists. All they have to do is get in touch with me on my website.
And your website again, what is your website so people can know to go
It's
to?
www.saraijames.com, and I'm going to spell that out. It's SARAIJAMES. But you can also Google me on Sara James Getting Words to Work, and you should find me.
Sweet. Well, I know there will be people reaching out. So thanks
Looking
again,
forward
Sarah.
to it.
Thanks again,
Thank you,
Sarah, for
Jason.
your time.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share with your friends and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know what you enjoyed the most about the podcast, and you may even be featured on a future episode. When you're ready to turbocharge your leadership development, join the Briefing Leadership Program, where you get access to everything in one place and can interact directly with me in the group. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy's video on-demand learning platform at ondemand.criskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you will also have access to hundreds of video on-demand learning opportunities. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.